What's up, community? I hope you are all doing well. Today I want to share a very horrible and gruesome experience that happened to me in a hospital in the United States. First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Francisco. I was born in the United States and have lived here almost all my life. But my parents and almost all my family are Mexican. So, I consider myself one too. I studied nursing and graduated in 2010, and after that, the real work began. The first 5 years of work were somewhat stressful, but like everything, you gradually get used to it. However, what you never get used to are those strange things that often happen in hospitals and mostly have no explanation. In 2017, I was transferred to another hospital because they said they needed staff. It was an old government hospital. Up until that moment in my life, I had only worked in private hospitals. Nevertheless, I was very well prepared, so I accepted without complaints. The pay would be just as good, although the workload might increase a bit. When I arrived, a colleague showed me around and gave me the instructions, schedules, etc. He also mentioned that the top floor, the 6th floor, was not in use. It was abandoned, and it didn't even have lights. He emphasized that I should be careful with the elevator and not accidentally press the button for the 6th floor, as it could take me up there. He said this had happened to other colleagues. I thanked him for showing me around and for the instructions. I was ready to start working. Honestly, I was excited about the challenge even though I had to work the night shift 3 times a week, which I didn't like much, but I accepted it gladly without complaining. A few days passed and everything was normal. It was a bit heavier than my previous jobs, but nothing I couldn't handle since I was prepared for it. But one night, something happened that I never wanted to experience. I was on the night shift and arrived at the hospital around 10 p.m. I remember that reception was very quiet. There were no people, just the receptionist and the maintenance man. I greeted them and went down the hallway where the elevators were to go up to my floor, which was the 5th. At the end of the hallway, I saw a woman in a patient's gown entering the elevator. I tried to catch up with her because it wasn't normal for patients to walk the halls without a nurse accompanying them, but by the time I reached the elevator, it had already closed. I waited outside for the elevator to return, but looking up, I noticed that the woman had stopped on the 6th floor and then began to come down. I thought she would still be in the elevator when it opened again so I could guide her back to her floor and ask her what she was doing there. But when the elevator doors opened, there was no one inside. I realized this woman was stuck on that floor which didn't even have lights. I thought she might be a confused patient due to medication and was trapped there, so I went up to get her. But when I arrived on the 6th floor and the elevator doors opened, I saw that the area was functioning. I was very surprised. There were no people, but all the lights were on. The place looked clean and equipped like the other floors. There was no one around, but I heard voices coming from the rooms. While still in the elevator, I didn't want to step out for fear of being caught on camera. At first, I thought it was an exclusive floor where they did other kinds of things. Maybe you'll say I've watched too many movies, but I was scared the owners would know I had seen something I shouldn't and something might happen to me. So I decided to go back down to the 5th floor, but I couldn't hide my nervousness and confusion. A colleague named Linda, who was my floor companion and had become a friend, saw me immediately and asked what was wrong. I didn't know whether to trust her and tell her what I had seen, but I couldn't hold it in and told her everything because I needed to vent and see if I could get any information from her. I never expected her reaction. She was shocked and scared and kept repeating, "It can't be possible." She told me she had been on that floor once when the elevator took her up for some reason while she was inside, but when the doors opened, there were only debris and everything was dark. We both stood there, stunned, thinking and turning it over in our minds until she said we had to go. She told me to wait until 4 a.m., when everything would be quieter, at the elevator door. I agreed because even though I was scared, I couldn't live with that doubt. I simply couldn't. When the time came, we first made sure no one was in the hallway to see us, as the floor number is visible from outside the elevator, and we didn't want anyone to notice. We didn't know whom to trust. We went up there and I couldn't believe what I saw. The floor was as Linda had described it, empty and abandoned, with debris everywhere and extremely dark. Only the light from the elevator illuminated anything. I cursed in shock and told Linda what I had seen a few hours earlier. She said she believed me because she could see my surprise and how pale I had become. She then said she believed me because she sometimes heard footsteps above, but never questioned them, thinking they might just be animals. Now she was starting to doubt that. But that wasn't the worst part. When we pressed the button to go down, the elevator doors wouldn't close, and we were there alone with that eerie view of the floor, completely exposed and with no one knowing we were there. We started to get scared as the vibe was getting heavier. I remember Linda began to feel pain in her bones out of nowhere and said she had never felt such pain before and didn't know what was happening. My legs started to go numb, so much so that I had to sit down. This had never happened to me while standing. It was completely disturbing. We knew that something evil inhabited the place. You could feel it in the air. Those who have ever felt it will understand. During all that time, Linda tried to communicate with reception through the speaker button, but no one answered. Finally, we heard a woman's voice. We both felt relieved, thinking the receptionist had finally answered. Linda explained the situation and asked for help, but the receptionist just laughed in a sarcastic and very inappropriate way, and then said, "You'll be fine." After that, she said nothing more, and Linda couldn't get in touch again. I didn't have my cell phone because I had left it charging downstairs, and Linda had no signal, but we could see the time. It was almost 5 a.m. We had been in that horrible place for nearly an hour, feeling pain and bad energies with that horrible view in front of us. Then the worst thing happened. We heard noises at the end of the hallway. We couldn't see that far, but it sounded like someone was walking through the debris. Linda and I, tense and full of fear, kept silent. She suddenly pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight. I wished she hadn't because we saw a woman in a gown crawling on the floor coming toward us. Linda dropped her phone, and we both started screaming. I got up with adrenaline and began pressing all the elevator buttons. Finally, it worked, and the doors closed, and the elevator went down to reception. We both got out of there almost crying. I was trembling, and Linda seemed stunned. After that, she angrily went to the receptionist to ask why she hadn't helped us and had laughed at us. But the receptionist looked very confused, saying she never received any call from the elevator and hadn't spoken to anyone. Her face was very serious, and I knew she was telling the truth. Besides, the elevator voice was much higher pitched, and the receptionist's voice was deeper. But Linda kept telling her that we had been trapped in the elevator since 4 a.m. and that it was now 5. Then the receptionist pointed to the clock, showing that it was just about to be 4 a.m. Linda took out her phone and saw the same time we had seen when going up to the 6th floor. We never understood why that happened. We don't know if it was an error on Linda's phone or if we entered some kind of limbo where time stopped. We'll never know. What I do know is that we never went back up there, not out of curiosity or for any other reason. We avoided it at all costs and never told anyone else what happened, not even other colleagues. It was an agreement Linda and I made. I no longer work there, but even though I tried to investigate online what was once done on that floor and why it was no longer in use, I couldn't find anything. It seems that it was something that the government or someone very powerful did not want to be known. It never came to light or it was hidden very well. Hospitals hold many secrets, more than you can imagine. Their energy is already dense because of everything that happens there, but imagine when heinous things are done in those places. The vibrations become unbearable. My name is Ignacio, and I have been a nurse for 9 years. I have worked in various hospitals throughout my career. I no longer live in the city where I began because I was transferred to another city for work. In each hospital, something different has happened to me. On this occasion, I will share what occurred during my first year of work when I was still a novice. I got a job at the general hospital in my city. I was very excited and happy because it is difficult to get a job there, but I managed to do it. The first few weeks went relatively normal, but then something strange started happening. One time we were in a complicated surgery. I was one of the assisting nurses to the doctor. We were working, and I was helping the doctor along with 2 other colleagues. When the doctor asked me to get a tool from a table a few steps away from where he was operating, I turned to find what he was asking for. I found it and took it. But when I turned back to hand it to the doctor, I saw a man standing in the corner of the room by the door. He was also dressed as a doctor, with a lab coat and a stethoscope around his neck. But he was not a doctor there. At least I had never seen him nor been introduced to him. The doctor yelled at me to hand him the tool, so I did and apologized. But when I turned back to look at the man, he was gone. Not just anyone can enter that area, especially during such a risky surgery. And the strangest part was how he disappeared within seconds. After that, the surgery ended, and everything went well, fortunately. That night I asked one of my colleagues who was also there if she had seen the doctor standing in the corner of the room during the surgery, but she looked confused and said no, that the only doctor present was the one performing the surgery. She asked if he was one of the doctors who worked in the hospital, but I told her I had never seen him before, which struck me as very odd. She suggested that I might have imagined it since there were no other doctors working in the hospital aside from the ones we already knew. So, I let it go, and although I knew it was real, I made myself believe that I had imagined it, perhaps due to the pressure of that high-risk surgery. But deep down, I knew that was not the case. The following night I had the night shift, which I initially liked because the hospital is much calmer and quieter at night. No visitors or people walking down the halls. Everything is more peaceful. But that night was not peaceful at all. I had a patient, a 45-year-old woman who was there for kidney problems. She had been hospitalized for some time, and we had become friends because we talked daily, and she told me many things about her life. That night I went to check on her and give her medication before she went to sleep. When I entered her room, she was happy to see me, but I noticed she looked a bit scared. I asked if she was okay because her face had an unusual expression. She was usually very cheerful despite her condition, but that night she seemed so different. She said, "A little while ago, a doctor I don't know came in. I thought he was new and had come to check on me, but he just stood by the door, watching me without saying anything. Even though I was talking to him and asking who he was, he never answered. Then he simply left the room, leaving the door open, and went away. It really scared me. I asked her to describe him to see if I knew who he was, but when she began describing his facial features, I knew it was the same man I had seen in the surgery. I told her to calm down, saying, it must have been one of the floor doctors doing a last round before leaving. I said this to reassure her, but she was not convinced and said she had a bad feeling about him, that she didn't like the way he looked at her, which made her very uneasy. I gave her the medication and stayed with her until she fell asleep, then left to attend to my other patients. The night was endless. I continued working, ensuring all my patients were well. Almost all of them were asleep, so I went down for a few minutes to make myself a coffee and found 2 of my colleagues there. One of them was the nurse I had told about the man I saw during surgery. I noticed they were talking with a look of confusion, and as soon as I entered, one of them said he saw him too during surgery. I asked what they were talking about, and the other nurse said that a few minutes ago she was doing her round on her floor and saw a man dressed as a doctor standing at the end of the hallway. She didn't recognize him, so she called out for him to identify himself. But the man walked towards a small hallway that has no exit. There is only a large window that overlooks the street. She was a bit scared but walked slowly towards that hallway. knowing the man was still there because there was nowhere else he could go. But when she arrived, the man was gone. She was very frightened because they were on the 4th floor. She looked out the window, but there was nothing below, so her only conclusion was that it must have been a ghost or something similar, as she strongly believed in such things. But I didn't. I wanted to find a logical explanation because the last thing I wanted was to be scared at my job. I didn't want to tell them that my patient had also seen him, as they would become more suggestive. And honestly, I didn't want the subject brought up again, as it did scare me a bit. When I went back upstairs, I saw one of my patients, an elderly man with Alzheimer's, in the hallway. I rushed to see what he needed because he had left his room at that hour. All he said was, "I don't want to be here anymore. That man wants to hurt me. I'm leaving." It was very difficult to convince him to return to his room. I needed the help of another nurse to get him back in because he refused, and we couldn't force him as we might hurt him. Even though the man had that condition, I knew whom he was talking about, and of course I believed him. It was a very long night, and I could barely sleep, dreaming about that man. I knew he was some spirit wandering that hospital, but I didn't know if he was good or not. During the day, I never saw him. It was at night when my patients would inform me that a doctor had entered their rooms but didn't say anything, just watched them from the door and then left. I only saw him 2 more times, and my colleagues on the night shift even started making jokes about it, as they had gotten used to the presence of that man. One day we told a very young doctor who worked there and got along well with us about it, and he wanted to know who it was. The next day, he showed us a very old newspaper from the hospital and asked if the man in the photo was the one we had seen. It was him. It turned out that Doctor worked in the psychiatric ward of that hospital in the 1950s and had been condemned for experimenting on his patients. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison but took his own life after just 2 months there. We were all shocked, and I felt even more frightened knowing this, as he had been a very bad person. So, what were his intentions in appearing in that hospital at night? I stayed there for 2 years until I was transferred to another city. But during that time, everyone saw him. Every patient who was admitted told us they saw a doctor at night. And even though he never did anything harmful, his mere presence was enough to terrify the patients and those of us working the night shift. I know he might not be the only one wandering the halls of that hospital, as it is a very old building with countless deaths and terrible things happening in some hospitals, especially those as old as that one. But for some reason, he made himself see. I don't know if he wanted to instill fear or what his goal was, but he managed to give us all goosebumps. This was my first paranormal experience as a nurse. Hello everyone, my name is Leticia and I would like to share my story with you. It happened while I was doing my medical social service. I had shifts that lasted up to 20 hours straight at the general hospital in my city, and many strange and paranormal things occurred there. That hospital has a lot of history. It is very old. Additionally, it was where the bodies of all the people who lost their lives in 2020, due to the global event we all know about, were brought in. I wasn't on duty that year, but a year later, when I started working there, I made friends with a guy and a girl who warned me about things that happened in that place, but that I would get used to it eventually. I asked them to be more specific about what kind of things they meant. They told me many anecdotes that had happened to them and other colleagues in that hospital, especially during night shifts, such as objects moving by themselves in the morgue room and in the building where they stored these bodies before turning them into ashes, because they were infected. Crying and screams were heard on various occasions. Initially, I didn't believe them since I was just starting to work in hospitals and didn't know that this happened more often than we think. At that time, my stance was, until I see it, I won't believe it. A few days passed, and one night as I was leaving the hospital, I was walking through the parking lot to get to my car when I heard some bangs. At first, I didn't know where they were coming from. I looked around and even took out my pepper spray from my bag because I got really scared. But when I turned to the building I mentioned before, I saw hands banging on one of the small windows at the top of that area, which was once filled with piled-up bodies. I got very scared, ran to my car and locked it while I was breathing heavily, and many thoughts were running through my mind. That place is locked and not in use. It is always padlocked. So I started to believe a little in what my colleagues had told me. The next shift, I arrived in the afternoon at the hospital, and at the first opportunity, I told my new friends everything. But they didn't look surprised. They responded simultaneously. "We told you so." A few days later, another equally disturbing situation happened to me. I was assigned, along with another colleague, to take a body to the morgue of a man who had just died. I don't know exactly what time it was, but it was early morning and the morgue was empty. Yes, it was full of bodies, but the forensic team wouldn't arrive until the morning, and the bodies stayed there all night. That place was quite tense, and nobody liked to go there. For starters, it was in a very isolated part of the hospital, and several lights in those hallways didn't work. It was so dimly lit that it seemed intentional to make the place more gloomy. We were pushing the stretcher down that long hallway leading to the morgue. We were almost at that room when we stopped because we heard noises coming from inside. It sounded like some stretchers were creaking, which gave my colleague and me goosebumps, although he seemed to be enjoying it because he was laughing. I don't know if it was nerves or because he genuinely liked that kind of thing, but I was truly scared, especially because of what I had seen on previous nights. "Come on, let's go in. Nothing's going to happen," my colleague said. We continued walking, pushing the stretcher to enter there, and upon entering you could see all those bodies covered with sheets on different stretchers. None of them were uncovered. The atmosphere felt heavy and unpleasant. I just wanted to leave. We placed the man on the stretcher, turned off the lights, and both left the room. But as soon as we stepped outside, the door slammed shut by itself. Before we started running, I heard the stretchers creaking again, but this time it was louder. We both ran out of there. My colleague was no longer laughing. Now you could see fear on his face because that door is very heavy and cannot move by itself. And of course, no wind enters that place. As time passed, more things kept happening. I remember one day a patient was very agitated. She was usually very calm, but that night she was screaming and asking for someone. 2 nurses and I ran to her room to see what she needed. I remember we turned on the light and I could see her face full of terror. She was lying with her feet hanging off the bed, saying that someone was in her room and felt like she was being pulled by the ankle, almost dragging her off the bed. We asked if she could see who it was, but she told us it wasn't a person. It was something else because it was there the whole time until we entered and turned on the light. We didn't know what to say, but she was very agitated and scared, wanting us to call a family member to stay with her, but that wasn't allowed. So one of the nurses stayed with her until she fell asleep. I couldn't because I had other things to do, but what happened with that lady made me think a lot. Her face said that what she was telling was true. Besides, she couldn't have gotten down on her own because she was in poor health, and we always had to help her get up or adjust in bed. But the worst thing that happened to me in that place is what I'm about to tell you. One night, I was leaving the hospital to buy coffee and something to eat at a convenience store a block away from the hospital. We always went there. I was walking through the parking lot between the building where I worked and the other one that is decommissioned, the one where I saw those hands banging on the window on my first days. I was walking normally when I heard screams coming from that same place. But this time I could clearly hear, "Get me out of here." I ran back to the hospital, told 3 colleagues, and said I needed their help because I thought there was really someone inside that building. I told them what had just happened to me, and one of them, after trying to calm me down, said that there was no one there, and I shouldn't worry, because it was normal for such things to happen. But I was not convinced because what I heard was so clear that I genuinely thought there were people trapped there. So, I asked them to come with me to look through the windows to be sure. They agreed, but already knew what I would find. We went outside, and they put a trash can upside down for me to stand on and look in. I climbed up, turned on my phone flashlight, and indeed, the place was empty. After that, I tried not to go out to the parking lot alone anymore because I almost always heard things coming from there. I feel a lot of sorrow and truly regret everything that happened to those people in that terrible year. No one deserves to leave this world alone without any family by their side. Every night I pray for all of them, asking for them to be resting in peace and to be in a better place. All of us at the hospital were sure it was them when we heard people screaming inside because a nurse who had worked there longer told us that before that year, it didn't happen in that place. Strange things happened in the hospital, but not there, as it was simply a laboratory that wasn't used until that year. As for the hospital itself, as I mentioned, strange things always happened. It is the oldest hospital in the city, so it's not far-fetched to think that many energies, and why not, some souls too, roam that place. Thank you for listening to these stories. I hope you enjoyed them. Much more content is on the way. Subscribe and activate the little bell so you don't miss any of the upcoming videos. Have a great evening, everyone. See you next time.